Reb, I don't know how much time you've got left. We've got about 10 minutes left on
Go.
the hour and a
Go
half.
for it.
I have a written one, just real brief, that you could probably spend a day on if you wanted to. How do you respond to Christians when they say they believe in Jesus because of the proof that there was no body found in the tomb? That's why they believe in Jesus.
I'm just speechless. Like, how do you know there was no body found in the tomb? In fact, the earliest description of Jesus' resurrection does not mention an empty tomb. Talking about Paul. The oldest surviving Christian literature, the oldest, is Paul's letters. Okay? Unlike the Gospels that are written in the 70s, 80s, 90s, could have been, some of it could have been written into the 2nd century. Could have been, but let's steelman this. So Paul's letters are all written in the 50s, right? 50s is still, 2 decades after the putative crucifixion. But Paul doesn't mention an empty tomb ever. Not once. In 1 Corinthians 15, the most famous chapter in Paul's letters, where he goes through and explains why you should believe in the resurrection, nowhere does he claim that there were women who came to the tomb and found it empty. Do you understand the magnitude of that? Like, if you look at the Gospels, all 4 Gospels, it is women that come to the tomb and discover it to be empty, okay? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are different than John, but in this regard, not that different, except that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have more than one woman, and John is just Mary Magdalene, John chapter 20. I mean, Christians go on endlessly about women coming to the tomb and finding it to be empty. And none of those features are found in the oldest surviving Christian literature. There's no mention of the women discovering the tomb empty. In fact, there's no mention of anybody finding a tomb empty in Paul's letters. So I don't know why Christians don't notice this. Now, you're probably saying, well, yeah, it doesn't mention that Jesus' tomb was empty. No, well, Christians are going to respond initially by going, that's not possible. I'm not kidding. So right now, the Christians that are watching me and listening to me now are just going through Google right now. Right now, they're going through their New Testament trying to find why I'm wrong. They're going to discover that I'm not wrong. There's no mention of an empty tomb in Paul's letters. It's prominent in the Gospels, so the Gospels are much, much later. And there's no mention of the women discovering the empty tomb. That's all in the Gospels, much later. Much later. And if I'm wrong about anything, I say often the book of Mark is written 70. It's probably later than that. I think I'm going with the standard dating of Mark 70, Luke and Matthew 80, 85, and John 95, like that standard fare. I'm keeping it very conservative. For many reasons, I think it was written later than that. But you know how crazy that is? So it's not even there. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, well, doesn't Paul preach Christ crucified, that Christ was crucified and he rose on the 3rd day? So isn't rising from the tomb on the 3rd day equal to an empty tomb? No, it's not. Well, what do you mean, Rabbi? Well, it's really very simple. In the ancient world, most people believed in an afterlife. Not all, but it was widely believed. Let's talk about the Greco-Roman world and beyond. We don't have to stay restricted to that. People believed in God. There were almost no atheists as we know that term today. There were people who didn't think that God or the gods were involved in human affairs. There were people like that, but an atheist didn't really exist then. I've not encountered it. But here's what people did not believe. People did not believe, except for the Jews, that the physical body would resurrect from the dead. What in the Greco-Roman world, it was widely believed that there is an afterlife. But that afterlife was a spiritual life. So the person was transformed from a physical body into a spiritual body. No one wanted to go back to that physical body, which they saw as a broken, a broken vessel. I mean, the ancient world. Look, if modern medicine didn't exist, I'm talking to you, would you be alive today? Probably the answer is no, right? If I ask you, you're watching me now, if modern medicine did not exist, would you be alive right now, right? Not all of you, but a great deal of you going, no, actually, I'd be dead. So imagine the ancient world that was just full of people just dying in enormous pain. Young, usually. There are people who dodge bullets. There are. You know, my grandmother got tuberculosis before they came up with antibiotics. She was a young woman, and in the 1930s, and they sent her off to, I think it was Colorado, and she was there. It took her a few years, and she beat it. She did. She was a young girl. She was a mother at that time. She was a mother of 3 children. She beat it, but she was a young woman, you know, so you have a shot at beating it, of course. So the ancient world was full of just broken bodies, miserable. People didn't know what hygiene was. They couldn't shower. They didn't brush it. Don't ask. It was a nightmare. People, and I say brush teeth, the thing that would probably kill you more than anything was your teeth. People died of infections coming from their mouth. So imagine all that. Why would you want to go back to that? And that's why Paul speaks about in that same chapter that the resurrected spiritual body of Jesus was strikingly different than the physical body of Jesus prior to the crucifixion. So here's the key. In the Greco-Roman thinking, whatever goes on in the tomb is not relevant. It's a spiritual body, an ascendancy of a spirit body that emerges. That's why there's no resurrection for Romulus, for Alexander the Great. There's ascensions of these great gods of the Greco-Roman world, but not physical resurrection, where the body literally becomes alive again and then walks out like a living person. That's not how people thought. And people thought that the Jews were crazy. People really, although Judaism, I think it probably somewhat like today, something like today. But although Judaism is let's say it's a respected religion, the one thing people could not get over is why the Jews want or believe that the physical body would be resurrected. They didn't know why would you want to go back to that wretched body? And Paul refers to his body as this wretched thing. There's a reason for that. So, right. So what we find in Paul's letters is, it means, for as far as Paul's concerned, there could be a physical body in the tomb, but Jesus could rise from the dead, but it's a spiritual body. And he talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. That doesn't mean there isn't a physical corpse in a tomb. That's why he doesn't use the term an empty tomb, because in the Greek mind, you would rise from the dead and have an afterlife. But that has nothing to do with the physical body being in the ground or being in a tomb. Do you follow? Now, what happens is this view of Paul is going to be rejected by the church. And we see that in the Gospels, where starting with Mark, there is an empty tomb, right? And then Matthew, it's more elaborate because Matthew actually ends with Jesus encountering disciples, same thing as Luke. Luke wants to show you that Jesus is not a spirit, So he's eating burnt fish and says, look, I'm not a spirit. What spirit do you know could, eat and drink? So Luke is pushing hard. And the story of Thomas that's found only in the book of John is pushing against it further. So they're all together pushing back against the ideas that emerged from Paul. That's the one area that Paul lost in. As it turns out, there's no mention of an empty tomb in Paul's letters. That's a later development of a physical resurrection, as we see in the Gospels. So it's really a remarkable thing that there's no mention of a physical resurrection. Paul uses a seed as an example of something that you plant in the ground, it dies, and what comes out, the plant, is something completely different. And that's how he compares the physical body of Jesus to the resurrected body. But as I said, that's the one area. Although Paul wins in other areas, meaning the church will adopt his theology, his doctrines, they don't adopt his view of the resurrected Jesus. And for the church, it'll be that he physically rose, and that's going to find its way very clearly in 3 of the 4 Gospels. Mark is unique because it ends at chapter 16, verse 8, and we don't have an encounter with the risen Jesus in Mark chapter 16. What you see from verse 9 through 20, those 12 passages, is a later interpolation, but we certainly see it in the other 3 Gospels. So thank you so much for your thoughtful question. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ועת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה